started here. So hello everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to State Trustees webinar on what to know before choosing an executor. So before we do begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So thank you all for joining us today. So I'm May Sivashambu, a relationship manager here at State Trustees, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. And on the panel with me, I'll be joined by my colleagues, David and Theo, and I'll let them both give a quick introduction to themselves. So David, we might start with you.
Okay, thanks, May. My name's David Andrew. I'm a senior advisor here at State Trustees. My role is to provide technical advice in the area of estate administration, help with the more complex estates. I've been with State Trustees for 15 years now, and very pleased to be here today. That's me.
Fantastic, thank you. And Theo?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Theo Apostolopoulos. I am also a relationship manager. I have been with the organisation coming up to 18 years in July. Time flies when you're having fun. And I welcome everybody to this webinar this afternoon.
Amazing, thank you. And for those that might not be familiar with State Trustees, so we are a government-backed company that provides comprehensive legal and financial services to all Victorians. So since 1940, we've written over 250,000 wills and administer more deceased estates than any other company in Victoria. Just for a bit of housekeeping, so the first part of the webinar, David and Theo will share their knowledge on executors and key considerations when choosing an executor of your will. And then at the end of the webinar, we have left some time for some Q&A. So if you do have any executor related questions, please feel free to type them in the chat section, and then we'll try to answer as many as we can during this time. But please don't worry if we don't get to your question. All attendees will be emailed a copy of the webinar, as well as the responses to the questions that we missed as well. Excellent. So let's get started with some questions, and we'll start with you, Theo. What's the role of an executor?
Okay, thank you, May. So just an overview. So the role of the executor, it has a number of tasks. So when a person is appointed as an executor in another person's will, not only is it an honour, they do have a duty. And part of those duties include things such as applying for a death certificate for the deceased, applying for a grant of probate, finding and contacting all named beneficiaries in the deceased person's will, obviously providing death notifications to organisations such as the Australian Taxation Office, Centrelink, banks, paying any outstanding bills or accounts that the deceased may have incurred up to the date of death. There's also, in some instances, they may have to defend the entitlements against any legal actions that come before or against the estate on behalf of the beneficiaries. They can also find themselves resolving any disputes between beneficiaries, obviously to close the loop with the Australian Taxation Office lodging final tax returns, claiming life insurance, superannuation benefits. In some instances, the deceased person may have set up a trust within their will. So obviously the executor will need to set up a trust and manage that trust, dealing with any real estate that may need to be sold to free up any equity to then distribute amongst the named beneficiaries, distributing assets in accordance with the will, and dealing with any other, assets such as shares, vehicles, caravans, properties, and the like. So it is quite an onerous role, and it's not for everybody. But look, I mean, it can actually prove to be somewhat, time-consuming. But definitely. That's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. And so, who can be appointed as an executor?
Who can be appointed as an executor? Could be anybody. As long as they are over the age of 18, that can be an individual person, a group of people, a lawyer, or a trustee company such as State Trustees to be an executor.
Thanks, Theo. We'll give you a bit of a break. So over to you, David. We'll pick your brain. Can I appoint more than one executor?
Yes, you can, and that's quite common. You can have two or more than two executors. I would say you'd want to consider two things. First of all, there's a difference between multiple or co-executors from substitute executors. And what I mean by that is you can have multiple or co-executors, which is I appoint A and B as the executors of my estate, with substitute executors, which is also an additional executor. It's I appoint A and B as my executors, but if A and B are unwilling or unable to act, then I appoint C. So C is an additional person, but it's a substitute, and that person will only act if the first two cannot. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I'd say is also, if you're appointing more than one person, just consider the practicality of what you're doing. There may be good reason for having more than one executor. It might be a blended family, or want to be even-handed with your children and the like. But what I think you do have to recognise is that when you've got more than one executor, they all have to act together. So they need to make decisions. They all need to sign documents. So you want to know that they're compatible and able to communicate with each other and agree. So it'll require a little bit more effort. So just think through why you're doing it. I'm not saying don't do it. As I said, it's not uncommon to be done, but just think through the reasons for it. But yes, you can have more than one executor.
Sure. Okay. So of the executors, can a beneficiary be an executor of the will?
Yes, it's very common. An example is, I appoint my spouse or partner as my executor, and I leave the whole estate to him or her. So, a beneficiary can be the executor, yes.
Beautiful. So it seems as though picking the executor is a really important step in the process. So what do you think are the top 4 considerations when choosing one?
Yeah, it is a critical decision to make. You need to get the right person or organisation. If we're talking about an individual, you need someone who's ready, willing and able to act. And what I mean by that is, first of all, they've got to be happy to act. So you should, I think as a practice or courtesy, sound someone out as to whether they're interested in undertaking the role, but particularly so if you're looking at a professional organisation or someone who's a little bit more remote relative than your immediate family, and just find out that they're happy to act. If you've got someone who's 87 years of age, or you've got someone who's got 3 children and a full-time job, they may actually not want to do the job. So just don't assume that what you think is an honour might be seen as a burden for them. So that's the first thing, is happy to act, then available to act, because you might have someone who's perfectly suited to the role. But if they're living in Sydney or, on a farm in, some remote part of rural Victoria, maybe that's not the best practical choice, because not saying that you've got to be in Melbourne or the like, but it's a consideration that you'd need to take into account. And then you need someone who's skilled. So ready, willing and able. This is the able side of things. It's going to depend, of course, upon the composition of your estate. Some are going to be more complicated than others, but you need someone who actually understands the role. And what I mean by that is, you're acting on behalf of other people. It's a trustee role. You're holding funds for the beneficiaries. You've got to deal with things that part of the duties are dealing with the body. So you're going to be available straight away and able to do it. You've got to make decisions, and not everybody is good at making decisions, particularly if there is some sort of family conflict and the like. And that's part of the role of an executor. You need to have some understanding of accounting and, taxation and asset redemption, because that's part of the role, to deal with the assets of the estate. But it's going to depend, of course, as to the the nature of the estate. I mean, you might have overseas assets, you might have a business that was being conducted. That obviously complicates it more, and you need the people with the appropriate skills to be able to deal with that. So it might also be just very basic things like, have they got a computer? Are they able to receive and send emails? I mean, we assume it, but, not everybody is in that position. But ready, willing, and able are the most important things. But given you asked for 4 and I only gave you 3, what I would say is, if you were considering, say, a professional executor like a solicitor, like an accountant, like a trustee company, the sort of considerations and questions I'd be wanting to think about would be, is that person or persons going to be around in 25 years' time when I actually need them to administer my estate? What if I've got a trust that might go on for 20 years myself? Are they independent? Will they do all of the tasks or just some of the tasks? So there are a few of the questions that I'd be wanting to ask if I was having a professional trustee act for me. So ready, willing and able, and those sorts of questions for professional trustees, I think would be my considerations when appointing an executor.
Sure, thanks, David. So Thea, we've heard on one side that it is an honour to be an executor, but on the other side, we've heard what a responsibility it actually is and how much time and effort it takes. So if you were asked to be an executor and you don't think you've got what it takes, can you decline the role?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, a lot can happen between, when you're appointed an executor or agreeing to be an executor and actually stepping up to the plate and fulfilling that role. Things change, circumstances might change. So if you have been appointed as an executor, but you don't believe you've got the capacity to fulfill those roles, and when I say capacity, it could all mean the time, the effort. That's the capacity, because you got to realize that not only are you looking after your own affairs, but you're also been asked to look after the affairs of a deceased person's estate. And that, as I said earlier, can be quite onerous. So yes, you can actually decline. And if you do decide to decline, there are some options, one of which is authorising our organisation, State Trustees, to administer the estate on your behalf. So there are options, and yes, you can actually decline if you feel that it may impact not only your life, your circumstances, but obviously the estate itself.
Okay, thank you. So also, just to everyone on this webinar, I just want to remind you that you can pop any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll hopefully be able to get to them at the end of this conversation. So back to you, David. So let's say we've now appointed the executor and it's time for them to act. So how long does it usually take to finalise the the estate?
Well, it depends. Not all estates are made equal. So it's going to depend upon the circumstances. There's so many things that can affect the timing of administration of the estate. I mean, things like just proving the will. I mean, if someone raises an issue of capacity, you might have to go out and look for medical material. If the body's with the coroner, it's going to be delayed before we can even get a death certificate to start. You might have complicated assets, which is things like, there might be an operating business that you've got to deal with that you can't just redeem and close. It requires a lot more effort. There might be claims over the estate that you've got to deal with, including litigation, or even if it's just a dispute over the distribution of chattels between beneficiaries, those things can be a time-consuming exercise. It may be issues with taxation. The assets you redeem might give rise to CGT implications that require special ruling. So what I'm trying to convey is that there might be a whole range of reasons that might delay an estate. Now, so it could take, a considerable amount of time. Now, there'll be people out there sort of saying, oh, yes, but what about the concept of an executor's year? Well, the executor's year, that's not unimportant. It's got some ramifications. Whilst most estates are resolved within the year, if it goes beyond a year, there are things like interest payable on legacies, a greater willingness of the court to inquire into any delay. but it will still come down to what were the circumstances, and there may be good reason for delay. But if you're asking me, most estates, if they're straightforward, without complication, would take 6 to 9 months to resolve, but there are others that might take years. So it's one of those it depends type answers.
Okay, sure. And how can state trustees help with executorship?
Oh, well, state trustees can help in a number of ways. I mean, people appoint state trustees as the executor of their will. So we come in and we're named, so we act. Others, where we're not named as the executor can come to state trustees and ask us to act. They can authorise us to act, and we'll administer the estate. We can act as a co-executor with others. So it can be another person plus state trustees. Or we can be a substitute executor, which is you appoint an executor, could be a partner, whatever, and then if that person can't do it for any reason, then state trustees can step in. But when you ask a question like this, I actually also want to raise a concept of advisory trustees. Now, the role of advisory trustee is something that's actually peculiar to state trustees via our legislation. And it's designed for situations where, just for using an example, let's just say someone, I want to involve my son in the administration of my estate, but look, I don't want to saddle him with the burden or the responsibility, or I don't think he's totally suited, or whatever reason might be. So what I'll do is I'll appoint state trustees as the executor, but I'll appoint my son as the advisory trustee. And by doing that, state trustees will liaise with him, discuss matters with him, get his opinion on things, involve him, even though he's not the decision maker. He's not personally liable for what occurs, but state trustees will work with him so he has an active involvement in the estate. So in answer to your question, state trustees can act because we're appointed, we can act because we're authorised, and on those two situations we come in, take it over, and we'll do all of those things there. We can act with someone else, co-executor, but the co-executor needs to be involved in signing documents, decisions, and ongoing personal liability. We can be substitute, or as I said, that concept of advisory trustee where state trustees acts, but we involve a nominated person and they have an active involvement without the responsibility. So they're the ways state trustees can assist.
Beautiful. So we've talked a lot about when there is an executor in place, or choosing an executor. So what happens in the event someone dies without a will? Who would administer the estate in that case?
Well, if you die with if you die without a will, you're said to have died intestate. And I'm going to tell you, about that because part of these sessions is we want to encourage everybody to make wills, whether it's with state trustees or elsewhere, have a will. And the reason you have a will is because if you don't, then you have no say in how your estate is going to be distributed. It's going to be distributed according to a formula which is set out in the Administration and Probate Act. That may or it may not suit you. Okay, some of the things that you can't do. Let's talk about what are the ramifications. You can't make specific gifts. You can't involve charities or organisations. There'll be no expression of wishes for funeral, pets, guardianship, whatever else. You can't select at what age beneficiaries will take. They will take at 18 years because that's what the legislation provides. It may go to people that you didn't want it to go to. And if you can't find someone closer than a first cousin, then it's going to go to the government. And that may not suit you either. But importantly, you have no say over who administers your estate. It will be a person with the equal greatest entitlement to the estate, but that doesn't mean they're the person who's best suited to administer the estate. And we find all sorts of problems, like, with blended families, the division of your assets between your current partner and the children of your prior relationship is not necessarily something that you'd expect. We have situations where parties, spouses have been separated for 37 years. Because they're not divorced, the spouse remains entitled to the estate. So, this legislation is there for good purpose, but it's a blunt instrument. And frankly, you may finish up with a result that you didn't intend. So if you get nothing more out of this session than this message here, please go and do a will so you get a say over what happens to your assets.
Excellent. Thank you. Sound advice there, David.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a little break now, David. And Theo, why should someone consider state trustees as an executor?
Okay. Appointing state trustees and choosing them as a professional executor means that they don't have to worry about when things turn, sour or pear-shaped. It means that you've entrusted the administration of the estate in somebody in an organisation who has been doing it for quite a number of years and takes on that liability and manages it from A to Z and deals with anything that comes its way and the curveballs. And look, I mean, let's face it, being appointed an executor can be overwhelming, as I've said earlier, and a lot of people feel that they sometimes can't navigate the role of the executor and the responsibility. So look, by appointing somebody or appointing state trustees as the executor means you're in safe hands. We do it well. We know our stuff. We're quite well connected in terms of we know what the processes are. We've got the resources. And as David said earlier, we're enduring. So we will be around for the next 10, 20, 30, 100 years. Grown, long time after we've actually left and retired. But look, the important thing is to choose wisely and choose somebody that will represent, I guess, your estate when you're no longer around.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, many of you might be wondering, how do I appoint an executor in my will? So there are a few options on getting your will done and appointing an executor. So I'll touch on two options. The first one is you can book an appointment with state trustees, will writing experts, and let them know who you'd like to appoint as an executor. I will let you know, though, our will writing appointments are currently fully booked, but you can register your interest. So then we can notify you when appointments can be made available. And the second option is also, if you prefer to complete a will from the comfort of your home, you can use the State Trustees online will and complete the executor section there. So for both options, we do have the links available in the chat either already or they will be in there shortly for you as well. Thank you, Theo and David, for answering this question. So we'll now move on to the audience Q&A session. So there's a few questions that have come through from the viewers. So let's start with the couple. So the first one is, can you appoint state trustees to write the will but not be the executor of the will? Theo, do you want to take
I'll take that one. You can. So essentially, as May mentioned, there are some options in preparing your will with state trustees. Obviously, the online, it's at your leisure, at your pace. We do also offer the face-to-face, or what we call the consultative will approach. So you can consult with us. We can prepare your will, and you don't necessarily have to appoint state trustees as your executor. You can appoint whoever you wish. But as David said earlier in this presentation, that it is vitally important to have a substitute executor, whether that substitute executor is another person or an organisation such as ourselves. That is purely up to yourself. But yes, the short answer is we can actually prepare your will and not be appointed as your executor.
Great, thank you. Next question is, if I have been appointed as an executor but do not want to do it, what are my options? David, do you want to answer this one?
Yes, I mean, look, if you're appointed, the options are you can act or you can renounce your role. If you renounce your role, you'll have to sign a renunciation and get some a supporting affidavit from a solicitor to say that the renunciation has been explained to you. Or if you don't want to act, you can authorise a trustee company such as State Trustees, and then they can take over and act for you. So you don't have to act if you don't want to, there are those options.
Okay, great. Just for the next one as well, David, I might stick with you. We've been asked, what are some common mistakes people make when appointing an executor?
Okay, common mistakes, righto. I'd say, well, not getting the right person, not ready, willing and able, as I spoke about before. But look, in relation to getting the executor clauses correct, the sort of issues that we see, and more often than not, they're sort of will kits, people preparing their own, and someone confuses the section for appointment of a sole executor with a multiple executors or co-executors, and they complete those sections and it becomes ambiguous, and it creates issues to be able to determine who's to act in that role. So getting the executor clauses right, one just its wording is correct. Secondly, having an appropriate substitute clause, it really is important. I know we've stressed it a few times, but if you pick an individual, then you really need to have someone in the alternate. So having a substitute clause if you've got an individual executor is, I think, very important. But further than that, it's also got to be an effective substitution clause. I'll give an example. I appoint A to be my executor, but if A predeceases me, then I appoint B. Now, sounds good, sounds fine. What happens is you die in 27 years' time. A survives you, so your appointed person survives you, but he lacks capacity. He's 97 years old, lacks capacity. Well, you can't go to B because your clause only said B can only come in if A predeceased. Your clause should have said, if A predeceases me or is unwilling or unable to act, then I appoint B. So we need to get the executor clauses right by making sure that we either have a sole or co, then we have a substitute clause, and then making sure it's an effective substitute clause. So they're my sort of bugbears when we talk about executors. Read instructions. If you're not confident about reading the instructions, then my advice is always go and see a professional will writer, and they will assist you through that process. Great.
And I'll again stick with you, David, for the next question as well. So we've been asked, what happens if my executor lives overseas?
You can have an executor who is resident overseas. The options would really be, in practice, would be they'd operate through a solicitor. They can provide instructions for the solicitor here, and the solicitor can assist. One of the things is the court may require a surety from that person. So in circumstances where you're overseas, and particularly if you're not a beneficiary of the estate, you might have to put up a surety. That's because if something goes wrong and you're outside the jurisdiction, how would they be able to get recompense? So they might ask for a surety. I don't say in every case, but that's a consideration. But if someone's overseas, and they might just wish to appoint a trustee company like State Trustees to take it over on their behalf. So there's no impediment, but it can add complications. I mean, things like attending to matters, time zones, being able to attend upon properties to view and look at things and distribute chattels and the whole lot. There's a lot of practical considerations that somebody who's outside the jurisdiction just makes it that bit harder again, but there's no legal impediment.
Great, thank you. We've also been asked if there's any information that you can share with an executor. So the answer is yes. We do have a checklist that is available, and it touches on the roles and responsibilities of an executor. So we will have that link shared in the chat for you, so you can have a look at that. And the next question that we do have is, does the executor need to perform any steps while the will is being written?
I'll have a go at that. It's the testator that writes the will, and the testator is the one who determines who's going to be the executor and provides instructions, executes the document, has it witnessed, all those sorts of things. The executor has no role at that stage. I've said before that I think you should sound somebody out beforehand and to find out whether they're interested in accepting the role. So in that sense, you might, as a matter of courtesy, ask the question, but they have no formal role in the execution, the making the execution of the will. And it may even be, even though I've sort of said you might sound them out, there's no requirement that you actually sound them out. And sometimes people don't know that they're executors until the person has passed and they're advised that they've been appointed to the role. That does occur, probably often when it's a substitute executor. So the executor's really got no role at the will making stage in a formal sense.
And if you want to change executor, do you have to rewrite your will?
Okay, look, there's two ways that you can change your executor, which is to rewrite your will, but there's also a concept called a codicil. And a codicil is a document where it leaves the original will on foot, and then you make some changes to that will. So what you'd say is, I refer to my will made on the 1st of November 1990. I delete paragraph 1 and insert a new paragraph 1, which appoints someone else as executor. In all other respects, I confirm the contents of my earlier will. So you keep the will on foot, you make the change, and when you come to prove that document, get your grant of probate, you're actually going to prove both the will and the codicil. Okay. One reason you might do a codicil is if it's only a modest change or change to, 1 or 2 sections, or perhaps even if there was perhaps some issue over capacity and you didn't, perhaps, but really it's when you're making modest changes. If you're making more significant changes, I think it's better advice to redo your will.
Fantastic. Next question is, can state trustees in one state, for example, Victoria, look after an estate in another state, for example, Queensland? The
answer is yes and no. Okay. In order for state trustees to act, we need an asset in the state of Victoria that gives us the jurisdiction to act. Having established the jurisdiction, then we have the ability to deal with assets in another in another state, and that's that's not uncommon. I mean, shares, very often the share registry is in a different state. Okay, and so we deal with that, or bank accounts might be from a different state, and that's fine. If you're dealing with real property, then you may require what's called a reseal in another state. In other words, you get the grant made in Victoria, you have it formally acknowledged or recorded in that other state, and by virtue of that reseal, you can then deal with that other asset. So the answer is yes, we can deal with assets in other states, but we need to have at least one asset in Victoria to give us jurisdiction to act. Okay. Now, the other thing I will say here is sometimes there might be overseas assets, and people say, will my will cover overseas assets? And the answer is maybe, which by definition means maybe not. There are countries, of course, that recognise Australian wills. I mean, any Commonwealth country will be fine, and many other countries. But there are a number of countries that don't recognise Australian wills. They've got their own system of inheritance. So you might have a will that you intend to cover your assets everywhere in the world, but if that other country, and it might be a European country or in Asia, they might say, we don't recognise a will, we've got our own system of inheritance, and deal with it that way. So with some of these questions, you might have to receive some specialised advice depending upon your circumstances.
Excellent, thank you. So another question that's come through is, as a couple, can we appoint each other as executor and as a backup if something was to happen to both of us? Then can we also add state trustees?
Yes.
You can. That's why it's important to have a substitute executor. Because if something was to happen, then obviously you've got somebody to fall back on.
Thank you. Just going through the rest of the questions. While we do read through the rest of the questions, do either one of you just want to expand a bit more on that response?
I think people sometimes, Theo, underestimate the importance of selecting the right person as executor. I don't think there's a full appreciation of all of the tasks that have to be done. And sometimes people say, why would I choose State Trustees rather than a solicitor? Solicitors do a lot of probate work, and a lot of them do it very, very well. But one of the differences is they don't do all of the steps. They do the legal work that they're asked to do. If you want to hand the responsibility to someone to do it from start to finish, end to end, and take personal responsibility for it, then that's where a trustee company has a point of difference. As I said, solicitors can be very, very good, but they don't necessarily get involved in things like clearing and cleaning properties, or in terms of the physical distribution of chattels, or doing the taxation returns or the like. So just think all of those things through. But I think sometimes people don't appreciate that you're handling other people's monies. There's lots of little steps, like even just notifying service providers, notifying Centrelink, notifying the tax people, making sure that you've identified all of the assets, because sometimes you don't know all of the assets. Maybe, for argument's sake, let's just say you're appointed to the will of your next door neighbour. You've known him for 40 years, you get on very well with him, that's why I appointed you the executor, but you've got no idea about his circumstances. And you have to, on day one, go and try and reconstruct what assets did he have, what bank accounts, where's the title, where's the will, who are the beneficiaries, I don't actually know them. I've then got to determine what the debts of the company was. He hasn't put in tax returns for the last 3 years. I don't know if he sold shares 2 years ago. How am I going to find it out? Bear in mind, not all estates are equal. Sometimes think it's all sort of husband, wife, and 2 kids, and a lot of those have their issues as well. But sometimes when you move away from that, they can become quite complicated and challenging. And once you've got family disharmony and disputation, it can be a very challenging role for people. So I know I've said it before, but what you think is an honour by appointing them executors can sometimes be a challenge or a bit of a burden to them. So just think it all through. That's all.
Yeah. And I guess in addition to that, David, is that there could be instances where beneficiaries live overseas, and you may not even know where these people live.
Yes.
So how do you locate these beneficiaries overseas? And sometimes records in several countries aren't kept up to date. So that in itself is quite an arduous task.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the class of beneficiaries might be something like, you might have someone that by virtue of you being appointed, because they don't have a partner and children themselves. So they might just, and they may have come from an overseas country, and they might just say, I leave my estate to all of my nieces and nephews who survive me. And if more than one, in equal shares. And all of a sudden, you're going to work out who the nephews and nieces are. How would you go about doing it? Now, at State Trustees, we have a genealogy section, and that's what they do. That's their job. But, for someone else, it's a bit of a challenge. Yeah. And it's a challenge because you might start making decisions about an estate where you really need to be involving the beneficiaries for getting some direction, as in, do you want to retain this chattel, or did you want to take a transfer, or are you happy for me to sell? If I sell, it's got a CGT consequence, or if I keep it, there's storage charges. All of these considerations, can be, as I say, a challenge. So when you're appointing your executor, which is the point of today, someone who's got the skills to be able to deal with those sorts of challenges that they meet is simply my point. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. We've got time for one last question. So we've been asked if there is an item of value not in the will, like a painting, does the executor have authority to distribute who gets the painting?
Okay, there's a few things. First of all, you can have specific. First of all, you don't list each and every item in the will, all your assets in the will, but you can certainly gift specific items if you wish. And, paintings are a good example of it. Motor vehicles, sometimes jewellery, family heirlooms, whatever it might be, can be specifically gifted. Sometimes you have a clause which is, I give all of my chattels and personal items to X. So, and it might even be, I give it to X to distribute according to my wishes. There's a whole lot of variations. But let's just say you don't have a clause that deals with chattels, and it just simply says, I give to my 3 children all of my estate. And then sometimes, yes, you can have a dispute over, 3 daughters, 1 engagement ring, 1 wedding ring. And they all want it. How do you do it? Or there is that painting that is very valuable. Who do you give it to as part of their share? And yes, that is part of the challenge of being an executor. You may be called upon to make those sorts of decisions, and that may lead to some angst or conflict or disharmony. And that's what I'm saying. Not everybody is suited to the role of executor because, yes, you do have to make decisions sometimes. Now, if it's a very important, large decision involving significant amounts of money, maybe you can go to the court and get some direction, but that would be unusual. Normally, it's left to you. And hopefully the will that you've written gives the discretion to the executor and also indemnifies them and gives them some protection when they make those decisions, because you don't want to have appointed someone and then find out as a result of which they, find themselves criticised or even sued for the decisions that they make. So hopefully that's answered it in some way.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. So that is all we have time for today. So thank you again for attending and submitting your questions. If we didn't get to your question, do keep an eye on your emails for a follow-up in the coming week. You should receive a few responses to the ones that we did miss. But if you would like to find out a bit more information about writing your will, your executor options with State Trustees, including fees and charges, please feel free to visit statetrustees.com.au/will. So the link is also in the chat. And I would also like to thank both David and Theo again for providing your expertise and time today. And
thanks, mate.
Everyone else on the call, have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.